Rachel Moore had never considered herself a person who attracted attention, and that was precisely the way she liked it. At 58, she had carved out a quiet, methodical existence in the small two-story house she had bought with her late husband more than 20 years ago. A modest but sturdy home in a neighborhood where people tended to know one another's names, but kept their distance enough to preserve a sense of privacy. After her husband's passing, Rachel had poured her energy into maintaining the property, refusing to let it slip into neglect, and she had invested in careful improvements over the years. The most recent project, which had taken months of planning and budgeting, was the installation of reinforced hurricane-grade windows, an expensive upgrade that she had justified as both a security measure and a way to reduce heating and cooling costs. These windows represented more than just glass and frames. To Rachel, they were a small but significant assertion of control in a world that seemed to grow less predictable every year. The work had been completed only a few weeks before, and she had admired the way the clean panes reflected the late autumn sunlight, their frames crisp and new against the weathered siding of the house. Her nearest neighbors were a mixed group: retirees who kept impeccable lawns, young families with squealing children, and a handful of long-term residents like Rachel who preferred a low profile. Across the street lived Karen, a woman Rachel had known in passing for years but never felt particularly close to, largely because Karen had a habit of making comments that walked the line between casual observation and judgment. In the weeks after Rachel's window installation, Karen had taken to remarking on them every time they crossed paths, noting how industrial they looked, or suggesting, in that half-joking tone that wasn't really joking at all, that Rachel was turning her home into a bunker. Rachel, polite by nature, had learned to smile faintly and change the subject, though she could feel the undercurrent of disapproval in Karen's words. One chilly Saturday morning, Rachel attended a community meeting for the first time in years, more out of a sense of obligation than genuine interest, and found herself sitting 2 rows behind Karen, who seemed to be in her element, chatting easily, with a cluster of neighbors. Near the end of the meeting, during a discussion about upcoming seasonal maintenance and rodent control in the area, Karen glanced over her shoulder, made direct eye contact with Rachel, and said loudly enough for others nearby to hear, "Some of us might want to be careful about sealing ourselves in too tight. All sorts of pests can find their way in, and sometimes you have to take stronger measures." The words were accompanied by a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Rachel felt a flicker of unease she couldn't quite explain. It was likely nothing, she told herself, just another one of Karen's ambiguous remarks, but it lingered in her thoughts for the rest of the day. That evening, as Rachel stood in her living room, watching the last traces of daylight fade beyond the gleaming glass of her new front windows, she thought again about the meeting, about Karen's tone, and about the subtle way those words had been aimed. There was no real reason to dwell on it, she reasoned, yet she caught herself checking the locks twice before heading upstairs for the night. In a neighborhood like this, the threats were supposed to be limited to squirrels in the attic or leaves clogging the gutters. But, for the first time in years, Rachel found herself wondering if it was possible for something darker to take root here, right on her quiet little street, and what she would do if it did. It happened on a Tuesday night, the kind of evening when the world outside the walls of Rachel Moore's home seemed utterly ordinary. The air was cool, the street lamps cast their familiar pools of light onto the quiet asphalt, and the only sounds were the faint hum of a distant television and the occasional rustle of wind through the maple trees in her yard. Rachel had finished her work for the day, balanced her books for her clients, and made herself a cup of tea, the sort of small domestic ritual that marked the transition from work to rest. She was sitting in the living room, the reinforced windows framing the darkened street beyond like picture frames holding a view she had known for decades, when the first sharp, percussive sound cut through the stillness. It was not the metallic clang of something dropped or the hollow thud of a branch hitting the siding. It was a distinct, high-pitched pop, the kind that carried a mechanical edge to it, and in the split second before she processed the noise, she felt more than heard the faint shudder of impact against the front of the house. The sound startled her enough that she set her tea down without taking her eyes from the window. She was still processing the fact that she had heard something unnatural when a second pop rang out, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of cracking glass. Her eyes darted to the far right pane, where a small, perfectly circular fracture had blossomed in the otherwise pristine surface, radiating outward in fine lines like a frozen spiderweb. The new windows, designed to resist hurricane-force winds, had not shattered, but the impact was visible and jarring. Instinctively, she stepped back, her heart thudding in her chest, scanning the street for any movement. The area outside was still and empty, the houses across the street dark except for the pale glow behind Karen's curtains. Rachel's first thought was that some careless teenager might have been shooting an air rifle, but the neighborhood rarely saw that kind of behavior, and she knew from the sound that it wasn't a toy-grade pellet gun. It was the deliberate, concentrated shot of something stronger. She moved toward the damaged pane, her slippered feet making almost no sound on the hardwood floor, and peered closely at the fracture. Lodged in the center of the web of cracks, half flattened from the force of impact, was a small metallic sphere. She reached for the hem of her cardigan to shield her fingers before plucking it from the glass, feeling its surprising weight in her palm. The smooth metal was cool, slightly oily, and entirely out of place here. She stood there for a long moment, the pellet in her hand, staring at the street through the distorted cracks in the glass, and it was only when she caught the faint movement of a curtain across the way that she felt the shift from confusion to suspicion. Karen's front window, which faced directly toward Rachel's, had been dark moments before, but now there was the briefest flicker of light and the outline of a figure before the curtain was drawn shut again. It might have been coincidence, but the timing made her stomach tighten. She closed the blinds, turned on the porch light, and locked the door without looking away from the street, the pellet still clutched in her hand. The next morning, determined not to let the incident slide into the realm of neighborhood gossip without a formal record, Rachel called the non-emergency police line. She described what had happened, gave her address, and asked for an officer to come by to take a report. The dispatcher's tone was polite but perfunctory, the kind that conveyed that property damage from a pellet gun was not going to be a high-priority investigation, but they did agree to send someone that afternoon. Before hanging up, Rachel was advised to keep the pellet and photograph the damage, which she had already done, and to avoid making direct accusations without evidence. She understood the subtext. This was not going to be treated like a major crime. When the officer arrived, he was courteous but clearly skeptical. He examined the damage, took the pellet in a small evidence bag, and asked if she had seen anyone outside. Rachel told him about the flicker of light and movement across the street, careful not to name Karen outright but unable to disguise her discomfort about the possibility. The officer nodded non-committally, noting that without a witness or clear footage it would be difficult to prove intent. He mentioned that air rifles and pellet guns were not technically classified as firearms under state law, making such cases tricky, but he would file the report. Before leaving, he suggested she contact her homeowner's insurance to handle the cost of repair and perhaps consider avoiding conflict with anyone she suspected. Rachel closed the door behind him and stood in the hallway, the weight of the exchange sinking in. The damage had been done, the pellet had been fired, and yet the likelihood of any accountability seemed slim. Later that afternoon, as she retrieved her mail, she found a folded sheet of paper wedged inside the box alongside the usual bills. It was a printed notice from the neighborhood committee, headed with a cheery seasonal logo announcing a community-wide pest control initiative scheduled over the coming weeks. The language was vague, referring to targeted measures for rodent populations and occasional incidental property impacts for which the committee regretted any inconvenience. Rachel read it twice, each line making her pulse rise until her eyes caught on the signature at the bottom, Karen's name in a loopy, self-assured hand beneath the title of Block Coordinator. The words from the previous day's meeting replayed in her mind, the way Karen had looked at her when she mentioned taking stronger measures. The pellet in her window was no longer an isolated act. It was, at the very least, part of a pattern, and at worst, a calculated warning. As evening fell again, Rachel found herself glancing more often toward the street, the glow of Karen's window a constant reminder that, in this quiet little corner of town, the line between civility and hostility could be crossed with nothing more than the pull of a trigger and a few casual words dressed up as neighborhood improvement. Rachel Moore spent the next 2 days moving through her routines with the strange, heavy awareness that the safety she had always taken for granted was now compromised. And although no further shots had been fired, she could not shake the certainty that this was not over. The police report felt like a formality without real weight, the officer's polite detachment lingering in her memory like a quiet warning that she was largely on her own. She had taken his advice to call her insurance company, and while the representative was sympathetic, the process was frustrating in its own way. She was told that an adjuster would have to come inspect the window. That documentation from law. Enforcement would help, but was not strictly necessary, and that the cost of the repair might still fall below her deductible. The implication was clear. This was her problem to solve. She arranged the appointment anyway, determined to have every piece of paper and every official record in place. It was on the morning of the adjuster's visit that the second incident occurred, though it was not as dramatic as the first, and for that very reason felt more invasive. She had stepped outside to sweep the front steps, the air crisp with the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the block, when she noticed a scattering of small, pale objects at the edge of her driveway. At first glance she thought it was litter, perhaps a bag of something that had been torn open, but when she crouched to look closer she realized they were tiny wooden stakes, each about the length of her hand, with a number written on it in thick black marker. There were 5 of them in total, spaced irregularly but all planted firmly in the ground just enough to remain upright. She pulled one from the soil, turning it in her fingers, and the sight of the number, 43, sent an odd chill through her. That was her house number. The others bore no numbers at all, just crude X marks or diagonal slashes. She looked up and down the street, but saw no one, and yet she had the unsettling sense that someone had been here not long ago. She removed each stake, set them in a paper bag, and brought them inside, her mind racing with possible explanations, none of them benign. Later, she would find more of these markers, tucked subtly into the strip of grass by her side yard, and even one leaning against the base of her mailbox. The insurance adjuster arrived shortly afterward, examined the damaged window, and made notes with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to small, strange acts of vandalism. When she mentioned the stakes, he gave a slow shake of his head and told her it might be worth mentioning to her lawyer if she had one. That evening, as the sun slid behind the houses and the street took on that dim, in-between light, she saw Karen outside, speaking with 2 men she did not recognize. They were standing beside a dark SUV parked at the curb, gesturing toward the row of houses, and although their voices did not carry, Rachel caught one of the men looking in her direction, his expression unreadable before he turned back to Karen. A moment later, all 3 laughed at something, the sound sharp and strange against the quiet. When the SUV drove away, she watched Karen linger on the sidewalk for several minutes, hands on her hips, scanning the street as though she were assessing it. By the end of that week, Rachel's sense of unease had deepened into a constant undercurrent of vigilance. She began keeping her front curtains drawn at night and double-checking the locks even in daylight. The wooden stakes continued to appear sporadically, as if someone wanted to remind her that their presence was ongoing, and each time she removed them, she felt a prick of frustration at the invisibility of the perpetrator. She decided that waiting passively for something else to happen was unacceptable, so she reached out to an attorney she had worked with years earlier during a property line dispute. The consultation was brief but reassuring. He advised her to keep meticulous records of every incident, to file supplemental statements with the police when new developments occurred, and to avoid direct confrontation with anyone she suspected. The first supplemental statement she filed was after the discovery of faint, shallow dents along the siding of her house, small enough that they could be dismissed as weather damage but arranged in a rough diagonal that suggested otherwise. She photographed them carefully and submitted the images along with her written account. The officer at the desk took the report without much comment, though she caught the slight tightening of his mouth when she mentioned that the incidents seemed targeted rather than random. Walking back to her car afterward, she noticed Karen's vehicle parked in a spot that afforded a clear view of the station entrance, though there was no sign of Karen herself. Rachel's world had begun to shrink in subtle, measurable ways. She avoided lingering in her yard, cut short conversations with neighbors who seemed increasingly hesitant to engage with her, and found her thoughts turning over the same questions late into the night. What exactly did Karen and those men want? And how far were they willing to go to get it? The pellet in her window had been a warning, the stakes in her yard a quiet intrusion, and the dents in her siding a sign that they were comfortable coming close to her home. None of it was overt enough to provoke immediate intervention from authorities, but each step was eroding the invisible line between her life and their interference. By the time another week passed without direct confrontation, Rachel realized that the escalation was not about sudden bursts of hostility. It was about creating a steady, grinding pressure, a drip of unease that could wear someone down until they either acted rashly or simply gave in, and she had no intention of doing either. If they wanted to make her a target, she would make herself the kind of target that was too costly to pursue. That decision, quiet but firm, would shape everything she did next. 2 more weeks passed in a slow but relentless tightening of the net around Rachel Moore's daily life, the harassment never crossing into violence that could be proven outright, yet always pressing just close enough to keep her on edge. She had fallen into a rhythm of hyper-awareness, taking note of every unfamiliar car parked within sight of her house, every change in the placement of objects in her yard, every faint noise at night that might be something more than the wind. She told herself this vigilance was necessary, that it was the only way to avoid being caught off guard, but she knew it was also exhausting her, drawing down reserves of patience she had spent a lifetime cultivating. The Pellet incident still sat unresolved in the police file, the report a cold, unhelpful formality that seemed to carry no forward momentum. The insurance claim was crawling through its process, and though she had an attorney now advising her, there was no magic bullet to stop the steady trickle of provocations. The stakes appeared less frequently but never stopped entirely, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes tucked just far enough into the hedge that she would spot them only when trimming back the branches. One night, unable to sleep, she sat by the upstairs window overlooking the street, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Around midnight, a van she had never seen before rolled slowly past, its headlights off, coasting as though to avoid making noise. It stopped for perhaps 10 seconds in front of Karen's house, then continued, only to slow again in front of Rachel's. She leaned forward slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver, but the van eased away without revealing anything. The next morning, she found a folded flyer tucked into the narrow gap of her front door. No envelope, no stamp, advertising property acquisition services, with an emphasis on streamlined exit strategies for owners under pressure. The language was blandly corporate, but the timing was not lost on her. The flyer went into her growing file of documentation, along with the date and time. A few days later, the situation shifted from quiet intimidation to something more direct, though still coated in plausible deniability. Rachel had been out running errands most of the afternoon and returned to find 2 men standing on the sidewalk in front of her house. They were dressed casually, but with the neat precision of people who wanted to project trustworthiness without looking like officials. One was holding a clipboard, the other a tablet, and as she pulled into her driveway they stepped aside but did not move away. She got out of the car, asked if she could help them, and was told they were conducting a neighborhood assessment on behalf of a local development group. When she asked who had authorized this, the man with the clipboard smiled in that fixed, non-committal way that revealed nothing and said they were speaking with selected homeowners about opportunities to contribute to the area's growth. The phrasing was vague enough to mean anything, but when she pressed further, both men became slightly evasive, thanked her for her time, and walked toward the corner where a third person she hadn't noticed before was waiting by another dark SUV. That evening, she called her attorney to relay the encounter, and he told her flatly that she should not engage with anyone claiming to represent developers unless they provided verifiable identification, which these men had not. He also suggested filing yet another supplemental police report, not because it would lead to immediate action, but because building a continuous paper trail was her best defense if the pattern of harassment escalated further. Rachel followed his advice, her description of the men and the vehicle now joining the steadily thickening stack of records that documented her ordeal. It was around this time that the property markers reappeared in a new, more unnerving form. Instead of the small wooden stakes she had seen before, there were now bright orange plastic flags, the kind used by utility companies, planted along the edge of her lawn. Each had a handwritten code on it, a mix of letters and numbers she couldn't decipher, and one in particular bore her house number in thick black ink. She removed them all, photographed each one, and logged the discovery in her file. Later that day, she saw Karen standing at the far end of the block, speaking animatedly to someone she couldn't see behind a parked truck, and when their eyes met, Karen didn't look away. Instead, she smiled slowly, almost indulgently, before turning her back and walking away. The next escalation came without warning. On a rainy Thursday evening, Rachel was in the kitchen preparing dinner when a muffled thud echoed from somewhere upstairs. She froze, listening. The house was old enough to creak in high winds, but this sound was distinct, as if something solid had struck the siding near one of the upstairs windows. She set down the knife she'd been using, moved to the foot of the stairs, and listened again. No further sounds came, but when she finally gathered the nerve to go up and check, she found a fresh dent just below the frame of the guest room window, a smear of dirt on the glass suggesting something had been thrown with force. On the ground below, partially hidden in the wet grass, lay a small stone wrapped in masking tape. She peeled the tape back carefully, and underneath, in cramped block letters, was the single word, "Soon." Her attorney urged her to give the stone to the police, which she did, though the officer who took her statement again reminded her that without fingerprints or witnesses it was unlikely to go anywhere. Still, the act of turning it in was important. It marked another clear step in the escalation, one that could not easily be dismissed as random mischief. In the days that followed, she began to feel the weight of eyes on her even in the most mundane moments, taking out the trash, collecting the mail, walking to her car. Sometimes she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, only to find nothing there when she turned her head. The turning point came when she received a letter from the city's zoning office, informing her that a routine inspection of her property had been requested by an anonymous source. It was couched in neutral bureaucratic language, but she knew immediately it was connected. The inspection was scheduled for the following week, and while she had nothing to hide, the intrusion was a violation of the boundaries she had fought to protect. It was no longer just intimidation. It was an attempt to introduce official channels into the pressure campaign, to use the machinery of the city itself as a tool. She called her attorney again, and this time his tone was sharper, advising her to be fully prepared for the inspection, to have her paperwork in order, and to treat it as part of the larger pattern they were documenting. That night, as she sat alone in the dim light of her living room, listening to the faint tick of the baseboard heat and the occasional hiss of rain against the reinforced glass, she understood that the nature of the threat had changed. It was no longer simply about unnerving her. It was about forcing her into a corner where the pressure would come from all sides, public and private, until the only way out was to give up what they wanted. She also understood something else, something that settled in her with the cold steadiness of resolve. Whatever game they were playing, she was already too far in to step back, and if they wanted to push, she would make sure they felt her resistance, at every turn. The inspection came and went with the quiet efficiency of two city employees who were clearly not interested in the politics behind why they had been sent. They walked through her property with clipboards in hand, checked the obvious things, the fence line, the exterior paint, the visible state of the roof, and made notes without offering much comment. Rachel had prepared everything as her attorney advised, having documents ready to prove that all recent renovations were up to code, permits properly filed, and maintenance well within the requirements. When they left, they told her she would receive a copy of the report within 10 business days. There was no hint of accusation in their tone, but she still felt the sour taste of intrusion, the sense that her private space had been opened just wide enough for someone else's hands to reach in. The next development came less than a week later, and it was sharper, more direct, stripping away any remaining pretense of coincidence. On a Tuesday afternoon, she returned from a grocery run to find a folded sheet of paper slipped under her front door. The message, printed in large, blocky letters, read, "You are making this harder than it has to be." There was no signature, no identifying marks, nothing that could be directly traced. She photographed it, slid it into a plastic sleeve, and called her attorney, who advised her to log it and hand it over to the police immediately. She did so the same evening, but once again the officer at the station reminded her that unless she could connect the note to a person, it would remain just another entry in her growing file of incidents without a suspect. Her attorney, however, was beginning to see a use for the accumulation of these events. He suggested preparing a formal harassment complaint to submit to the court, supported by the police reports, photographs, and her sworn statements. It would not guarantee immediate relief, but it could create a legal barrier that might deter whoever was behind this. Rachel agreed, and they began compiling the documents in earnest. But while she was moving through the slow, grinding gears of legal preparation, the harassment began to evolve in its methods. Twice in 1 week she found her trash bins tipped over and scattered halfway down the driveway in the early morning hours. It might have been dismissed as raccoons or wind, but the lids had been deliberately wedged under her car tires, and a faint trail of wet footprints, barefoot, human, was visible on the pavement leading back toward the street. She took photographs of everything, even measuring the length of the prints before the morning sun began to dry them. Around the same time, she noticed changes in the behavior of some neighbors she had known for years. A few seemed to avoid her entirely, crossing the street rather than walking past her yard, while others offered polite but distant greetings that ended quickly. It was subtle, but it carried the distinct feeling of someone quietly turning the social tide against her. The most obvious example came one morning when she overheard Karen speaking to a small group by her driveway. Rachel could not hear every word, but the phrase, "trouble for the whole block," drifted clearly across the air, followed by the kind of murmured agreement that people give when they want to appear informed but not involved. In response, Rachel tightened her own boundaries. She stopped engaging in casual conversations outside, kept her movements around the neighborhood minimal, and doubled down on documenting everything. She also had a motion-activated spotlight installed near the driveway, the one part of the property that was most exposed to the street. She didn't advertise the change, but she suspected it would make its presence known the first time someone stepped too close after dark. The spotlight came on for the first time just 4 nights later. It was close to midnight, and Rachel had been in bed when the burst of the white light lit up her window and the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel reached her ears. She moved quietly to the front of the house and peered between the blinds in time to see a figure moving away toward the street. The person was dressed in a hooded sweatshirt, the hood pulled low, and carried what looked like a long, narrow case slung over one shoulder. They didn't run, didn't even look back, just walked to a waiting vehicle and got in. She couldn't make out the driver, but the car pulled away without headlights, coasting until it was halfway down the block before the lights snapped on. The next morning, she found fresh pellet damage, small, neat dents in the metal of her mailbox and a faint chip in the paint on the front door frame. The pattern was unmistakable, and the message was clear. The game had returned to where it started, but this time they were edging closer to her directly. Rachel's attorney filed the harassment complaint the same day, attaching the latest incidents as supporting evidence. He also suggested she request a restraining order against any known individuals she could reasonably identify as part of the harassment, though without a direct citing, that list was limited. The legal wheels began to turn, slowly and with no guarantee of an immediate stop to the pressure. But Rachel felt the small reassurance that comes from putting something formal and binding into motion. That night, as she locked the front door, she paused to look out at the street. The block was quiet, the air still, and the only movement was the faint sway of branches in the cool breeze. Yet she knew that somewhere close by, someone was watching, waiting, adjusting their approach in ways meant to keep her off balance. And for the first time since the pellet struck her window weeks ago, she realized that they had underestimated her. Because she wasn't simply enduring anymore, she was preparing. The breaking point came on a night so still it felt as though the entire neighborhood had paused to hold its breath. Rachel had been awake later than usual, reviewing the latest draft of the harassment complaint her attorney planned to file the next morning. The glow of her desk lamp cast a warm circle on the paperwork, while beyond the drawn blinds the street lay in quiet darkness. Just after midnight, a sudden metallic ping rang out from somewhere in the front of the house, sharp and deliberate, followed almost instantly by another, and then the brittle crack of glass under impact. She was on her feet in an instant, crossing to the front room where she could see the outer pane of one of her reinforced windows fractured again, the telltale starburst pattern spreading outward from a single point. But this time she did not hesitate. She reached for the cordless phone she had left on the side table and dialed the police, keeping her voice steady as she told the dispatcher that an active act of property damage was taking place and that the person was likely still in the vicinity. She gave her address, confirmed she was safe inside, and was told units were already on their way. The motion-activated spotlight she had installed just 2 weeks earlier suddenly flared to life, washing the driveway in harsh white light. Through the narrow gap in the blinds, she saw a hooded figure crouched near the corner of the house, a long-barreled pellet rifle braced in their hands. The light caught the glint of the metal, and for the first time she saw the posture clearly enough to know it wasn't a teenager or an impulsive vandal. This was someone comfortable with the weapon, taking their time. The figure jerked upright at the light, glancing toward the street as if calculating whether to run, and Rachel caught the movement of another person across the road. Karen, standing just inside her own driveway, arms folded, watching. The realization settled cold and hard. She wasn't just a bystander, she was witnessing, perhaps even directing the act. The shooter moved quickly then, lowering the rifle into a padded case and slinging it over their shoulder before cutting toward a dark vehicle idling at the curb. Red and blue lights swept the street less than a minute later as a patrol car approached from the far end. Rachel stepped back from the window, letting the officers do their job, but she could hear the quick exchange of voices outside. The car that had been waiting roared to life, pulling away at speed, only to be cut off by the police vehicle as a second unit appeared from the opposite direction. Commands were shouted, doors opened, and within moments the shooter was on the ground, hands behind their head, while another officer moved toward Karen, who stood unmoving until she was told to step forward. An officer knocked on Rachel's door, and she opened it to the glare of flashing lights, giving her statement as concisely as she could. She identified the shooter's location when the spotlight came on, described the weapon, and confirmed that Karen had been present, watching from across the street. The officer nodded, making notes, and informed her that the rifle had been recovered from the vehicle along with multiple containers of metal pellets. They would be processing it for fingerprints, but the presence of the weapon during an active act of property damage was enough to take the shooter into custody on the spot. Karen, too, was detained after the officers learned she was connected to the shooter through recent communications, details Rachel would not know until later. For now, all she saw was her neighbor being placed in the back of a police car, her expression unreadable under the wash of the streetlights. The officers stayed for nearly an hour, photographing the damage, collecting the pellets lodged in the cracks of the glass, and documenting the scene. By the time the patrol cars pulled away, taking their passengers with them, the street was quiet again, but the air felt lighter, as if some invisible pressure had finally shifted. Rachel stood in the doorway for a long moment after they left, looking at the fractured window that had once been the start of all this. It would need replacing again, but this time it carried the satisfaction of evidence, proof gathered in real time that could not be dismissed as speculation. For weeks she had lived in the slow burn of intimidation, moving through careful, calculated steps to protect herself without escalating recklessly, and tonight that discipline had paid off. She closed the door, turned the locks, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in months, knowing the fight was not entirely over, but the balance had shifted in her favor. The weeks that followed were a blur of statements, meetings, and the slow, deliberate machinery of the legal process. The shooter, identified as a local contractor with no legitimate reason to be near her property, was formally charged with multiple counts of vandalism and unlawful use of a weapon within a residential zone. Karen's role emerged in the form of text messages and call logs recovered from the shooter's phone, suggesting she had orchestrated the acts under the guise of pest control and neighborhood improvement. While she avoided the more serious weapons charges, she faced misdemeanor counts for criminal mischief, conspiracy, and violation of municipal ordinances, as well as a civil suit Rachel's attorney filed on her behalf for damages and harassment. The restraining orders were granted swiftly, barring both individuals from approaching within several hundred feet of Rachel's property. The city's zoning office, perhaps embarrassed by having been drawn into the harassment campaign, sent a formal letter acknowledging that the inspection request had been baseless and expunged it from their records. Rachel's insurance covered the cost of replacing the damaged window and repairing the minor impacts to her siding and mailbox, and the spotlight she had installed remained in place, a silent sentinel against any future trespass. Slowly, the street regained its surface calm, though the social fractures left behind were still visible. Some neighbors made quiet, almost apologetic overtures, while others avoided her entirely, perhaps unwilling to confront their own silence during the months of intimidation. Rachel did not seek to repair those relationships. She focused instead on reinforcing the boundaries she had fought to protect, keeping her records organized, and staying connected with the few neighbors who had offered genuine support. Standing at her window one evening, watching the soft glow of the street lamps over the pavement, she felt the first real sense of ease she had known in months. The fear that had once lived in every corner of her home had been replaced by something steadier, a reminder that preparation, persistence, and the willingness to hold a line could withstand even the most calculated attempts to break it. The street was still the same, but Rachel knew she was not.